The mantra that we've heard from governments for years now: the state is inefficient, the state is wasteful, the market is efficient and competitive and will deliver public services much better than the state ever could. That was always a lie. But what we've seen with the coronavirus is just how big a lie that was. In the UK, the government bypassed our public sector and instead it went to the private sector. The person it went to specifically put in charge of its test and trace system, which is absolutely crucial to whether or not we get out of this pandemic, is a woman called Dido Harding. Now, Dido Harding was chief executive of the phone company TalkTalk, where she presided over some catastrophic failures, including a massive data hack, which exposed her as naive, ignorant, incompetent. She was very widely criticised for her response to that crisis, and there were widespread calls for her to resign, calls that she rebuffed. Nevertheless, she was a good friend of David Cameron's, and in line with his general policy of putting his friends into powerful positions, he made her a baroness and put her into the House of Lords, where, though she's never received any votes from us, she legislates apparently on our behalf and in our name. She also was appointed to the board of the Jockey Club, responsible for the Cheltenham Racing Festival. And in March of 2020, after we began to realise just how dangerous the pandemic was, the Jockey Club decided to go ahead with the Cheltenham Racing Festival, and 250,000 people attended. It's since been described as a super spreader event. Nevertheless, the government then appointed Dido Harding as head of its test and trace programme, this crucial programme whose purpose is to ensure that the coronavirus doesn't spread through the community. And alongside Dido Harding, all sorts of other private sector entities came in: Deloitte, Serco, McKinsey, and these companies have been mopping up vast contracts. In some cases, their consultants have each been paid £6,000 a day to help run this test and trace programme, on which our health, in fact even our lives, may depend. And the result? Catastrophic failure. It has failed so catastrophically that we're now going back into partial lockdown because we have a major second wave which isn't being effectively campaigned because we don't have an effective test and trace system. And so much money has been misspent. Some of the companies which have been given massive contracts without competitive tendering, just given them with a tap on the shoulder, a nudge and a wink, those companies turn out to have very close relationships with key people within and around the government. Under Boris Johnson and under many other governments of that stamp, the Treasury becomes a giant kitty for their chums. If we look at the contractors who are making a killing from the coronavirus, we see Serco, which is run by the brother of a former Tory MP, grandson of Winston Churchill, very well politically connected. Its former head of PR, Edward Argar, is now a health minister in the government. We see Deloitte hand in glove with government for a long time. We see McKinsey, which is almost a route into government. It's where Dido Harding used to work. It's where she met her husband, benefited from incredibly lucrative contracts. And then we see a whole series of extraordinary contracts given to companies which seem to have no background in that field, but do seem to be very well connected to crucial figures within the Conservative Party. So you might say, there might be something wrong here. Is this corruption? Is there dodgy dealing happening? The obvious person to go to is the government's anti-corruption champion. Just one problem. The government's anti-corruption champion is John Penrose MP, Dido Harding's husband. The people the government appoints to crucial positions, are they the most efficient people? Are they the most effective people? Well, to my eye, they look like privileged parasites. Dominic Cummings, who drives to Castle Barnard to test his eyesight, who managed to escape £50,000 of council tax for the second home that he built. These people are not those who best represent the public interest in public affairs. It's all reminiscent of the reign of George I, who gave his favourites these military procurement contracts, which made them into extremely rich people, who then created lineages which persist to this day. Now, I don't in any way blame people for their ancestors and their antecedents. That would be completely irrational. But it is worth looking at how people acquired the social position which led to them getting appointed to these crucial roles. I mean, Dominic Cummings, he didn't have to be interviewed for his job. Dido Harding didn't have to be interviewed for her job. They just get a tap on the shoulder. You and I are not going to get that tap on the shoulder because we're not part of that gilded circle. So how do you become part of this gilded circle? Well, in Dido Harding's case, it's because her grandfather was given a hereditary peerage. He was made a baron, and it meant that his son would be a baron and his son would be a baron, and he was given that hereditary peerage for his colonial services. I think we know what that means. He was put in charge of suppressing the insurgency in Malaya. He was also a key advisor on suppressing the insurgency in Kenya, and he was in charge as governor of Cyprus of suppressing the insurgency there. In other words, he was sent around the world to crush anti-colonial rebellions, and he did so with the help of torture, murder, and concentration camps. For this, he was given a hereditary peerage. Now, one of the people he advised and worked with in Kenya was Sir Evelyn Baring, who set up the system of concentration camps into which almost the entire population of the Kikuyu people were herded, and in which vast numbers were murdered, many others were tortured, many were mutilated, some were burnt to death, some were kicked to death. And he too was made a hereditary peer for his colonial services. Sir Evelyn Baring is the grandfather-in-law of Dominic Cummings. So these antecedents projected those grandchildren into that gilded circle of power, from which they were then chosen and given these crucial government appointments. The great contest in any political system is between the power of people and the power of money. It's a constant struggle to drag your system away from the power of money and into the hands of the people. When Boris Johnson talks about the market, when Mrs. Thatcher talked about the market, Ronald Reagan talked about the market is a euphemism for the power of money. And the power of money is not a neutral power. It's not a power that we all share. It's a power that is concentrated into the hands of those who have the most money. In other words, the market is a euphemism for oligarchy. And when Boris Johnson talks about shifting things out of the public sector and into the market, he's talking about shifting things away from democracy towards an oligarchy. The trajectory of the coronavirus pandemic shows us exactly why we should care about this stuff, because when money is not spent effectively, disasters happen. And we've seen this disaster unspooling in real time in front of our eyes. Instead of the money being spent properly on building an effective testing and tracing system, that money has been handed to cronies, the system has failed, and we're back into a massive second peak. People are dying because of the failures of this system. It should have been in public hands, but it was given instead to completely incompetent private hands. Rupert Murdoch and the other billionaire media barons, they're setting up TV channels all over the world, and we desperately need a counterweight to that. In Double Down News, there is this counterweight, and it operates on 1,000th of the budget. On a shoestring, it's reaching millions of people with things we desperately need to hear, but that the billionaire media will never tell us. So please, become a patron, support Double Down News through Patreon.